We say, we're establishing property rights. The government promises not to bash you over the head and take your stuff if you start a business. But here's the thing, in post-conflict countries, what's happened? And weak and failed states. Typically, historically, there's been groups fighting, or the government's been very bad, hence the name weak and failed states. So what happens? All of a sudden, you have a government that was weak and failed, meaning in the past they treated their citizens extremely badly, now saying, just kidding, going forward, we're going to treat you really well. And the citizens say, no, you're not. We know you're not. Because for the last decade, the last centuries, several centuries, you treated us terribly. So we're not going to buy into what you're doing. Take a look at this. Here's a quote I found in Afghanistan. All right, this was recently in the New York Review of Books to understand the problem of credible commitment. So we go into Afghanistan, right? We say we're liberating people and overthrowing the Taliban. So what happens? Well, first the United States says, okay, we're going to disarm you. Just kidding, we're going to rearm you. Then we're going to say, oh, local autonomy, self-determination. That's what's really important, right? And then we say, no, central government, that's what we're trying to do. And then we go back to decentralization later on. Then we say, opium, that's the major crop, so we're going to have to let that go. And then we say, no, we're going to start to eradicate all the opium crops, right? And then we come back and say, no, just kidding. And then what you have is this meta problem of credible commitment. Basically, people don't buy into what the United States is doing. On top of it, they don't even buy into what their own leaders are doing, which is precisely why Afghanistan was a weak and failed state before. There was massive lack of credible commitment. So when people make promises in this instance, people just don't buy into it. So what are some ways to solve this problem? Well, what you need to do is send a credible signal. Have you ever heard the story, for instance, of a general that leads his troops into war and turns around once they're past the bridge and burns down the bridge? So why? So his troops cannot run away. They can't retreat. What are they doing? Sending a credible signal. My troops are going to fight you till the death. How do I know that? There's no way for them now to turn around and run away. That's basically the equivalent of what you have to do. It's very difficult to do, but that's what you need to accomplish. So here's a perfect example of this. Right? People aren't buying in because they know the United States is going to leave. So what are they doing? They're trying to basically either get as much as they can now or position themselves in a place of power so that when the United States leaves, they have the power. Danny Roderick, who's a development economist at Harvard, he wrote on the transition economy. So after the collapse of communism, this was a problem then too, because for years there had been very poor management of the economy. So during the transition from socialism or communism to capitalism, they had to pass policies. And of course, you have this problem of credible commitment. And he came up with this idea of overshooting, which is basically you want to design a policy like you normally would under ideal conditions, and then you'll have to take several steps past it. So it may not be, for instance, let's say you want to reduce trade barriers. And you say, I'm going to reduce tariffs. And the citizens say, no, you're not. We know you're kidding. So what might you do? Well, you might pass some kind of regulation or constitutional rule or binding constraint on government officials, such as they can't raise them past a certain level. Or they might close down the customs agencies that would collect the tariff money that came in. They collect tariffs as things came in, or as they exported things, they taxed them. Right? That's sending a credible signal that you can't touch their stuff anymore. That's basically what you need to do. Without that, policies are not going to stick because people aren't going to buy into them. So that's the first thing, the problem of credible commitment. Second is the fatal conceit trap. The fatal conceit comes from the economist F.A. Hayek, his last book, I believe it's 1988, The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism. And basically, Hayek said that the problem with socialism was that it suffered from a fatal conceit. And the fatal conceit is the assumption that man can design society according to human reason. Basically, we can sit down together and design how we want society to look, and then implement that. Now, of course, Hayek was not saying that we don't have plans and design things. Of course, all of us have plans. You plan to come here and you're here, right? We design organizations all the time. Someone sat down and designed the economics club. What Hayek was talking about is, at some point, you can't do that anymore. You become so, your knowledge is limited, such that beyond certain limits, and it varies, and it's a little fuzzy what exactly that entails, you can't do it. But what he was talking about is you can't plan an economy, specifically the allocation of resources, which is what socialism tried to do. All right? So let's give some examples of what the fatal conceit trap looks like with Reconstruction. This is from the U.S. Marines Counterinsurgency Field Manual. You can purchase this at Amazon or get it out of the library. It's basically a guidebook for counterinsurgency efforts. Take a look. If you thought about the US military, whether you think they should be used abroad or not, if I said to you, what do you think they're good at? I would guess you'd say they're good at shooting, right? That's their specialization. If there's one thing I want the military to be good at, it's like shooting things, right? Providing security. Okay, so let's say we grant that. Take a look at some of the things they're claiming the military should do, all right? Mobilize development of local economic activities, initiate contracts, rebuild infrastructure, support economic opportunities, macro and micro. Use the military promoting micro and macro development. This is the fatal conceit trap, right? It's the idea that somehow a group of people can go in and basically design a free market economy. Notice the irony of this trap. Why do we like markets? Well, as Hayek pointed out, we like markets precisely because of dispersed and context-specific information. So the irony of the fatal conceit trap is we're trying to centrally plan a market precisely because we like it, because we don't have the knowledge to act, right? We need dispersed knowledge, so I can use your dispersed knowledge that's over there. You can rely on mine, then we can trade. Prices and profit and loss reflect that information. So the idea that somehow you can plan that precisely because we want a market, because we don't have that information, is absurd on the face of it. Here's another one. This is from the Army Stability Operations Field Manual. All right, take a look at what we want them to do. This calls for them to basically use force to provide a safe environment. Okay, there's irony there, but we'll put that aside for a moment. Facilitate reconciliation, so now they're engaged in reconciliation efforts. Establish political, legal, social, and economic institutions. Sounds easy, right? Establish political, legal, social, economic institutions, help transition responsibility to legitimate civil authority under the rule of law. All right? And here's the thing. Here's always, in my view, a rule of thumb to know if you're dealing with the fatal conceit trap. Very broad-based things that sound nice, right, but we really have no idea how to do. Right? These are like first-order principles. We know that stuff's important. We know private property is important. We know rule of law is important. Right? But notice there's no details about how to get any of this stuff. It's like if I said to you, yeah, just go establish property rights. It's all good to go. Everything will be great. Just do that and everything will develop. You'd be like, okay, that doesn't really help me. Right? I know that's important, but how do I do that? And that's the part of the fatal conceit trap. Here's a visual of the fatal conceit trap. This was, by the way, put together by a consulting firm hired by the US military. I don't know how this, we paid taxpayer dollars for this, by the way, so you should be proud of it. Here's Afghanistan. All right? So if we're going to fix a society, we need a plan, right? And what better way than to come up with a nice, colorful slide? So let's plan an entire country on one PowerPoint slide. I didn't make this up, by the way. All right? So it looks great, right? We got the insurgents, narcotics, we got it all covered, right? Infrastructure and services, popular support, conditions and belief, government. I mean, you got everything you could possibly want here. What's more, right? Then we connect them with arrows. We have two lines and there's a delay. So it's great. Well, you laughed when I put it up, but understand, this is what people are utilizing to spend a lot of our money abroad to rebuild Afghanistan. Now, they're not using this exact slide, right? If it's declassified, I could get it. But this is the kind of thing they're using. This is what happens when you fall prey to the fatal conceit trap. It's the idea that you can literally sit down and draw out with arrows an entire country. This isn't the entire country. It's not even the economic aspect. That's right here. But even if I just cut this square out, this corner, right, and put this up, you would have laughed the same way. Now, the even funnier part was, I read when this was online, someone said, why, this, because people are saying, this is absurd. And they said, no, because we're recognizing how complex it is. This is great, right? And it's like, well, what? I'm confused. If you recognize how complex it is, that should be a impetus to hesitate, to say, look, we probably shouldn't do this. Right? Instead, we're like, no, let's just draw more arrows, and then we'll call it good. Right? By the way, I've tried to follow this, and I actually have the full presentation, 35 slides. And they start actually with like one box, it's somewhere like here. And then you can see them building up in steps. Like by slide 10, it's so confusing, I couldn't follow it anymore.
It's actually called cognitive mapping software, and it's what we use to put a man on the moon.
What? Yeah. I mean, look, I don't deny that we can do. And also, by the way, that's a good point you raise. Which is here's a response people say to me. They'll say, look, this can work. We do things. We built things. We put a man on the moon. And my response to this is this. If we spend lots of resources on stuff, we can accomplish things like putting things on the moon. I don't deny it. We can build roads in Afghanistan, right? But the claim is that we can rebuild the entire country, All right? And we have very little evidence that that can happen. All right? So it's not